Okay, so the last video I showed you something called slope fields, how we generate them. We had started with the derivative of a function, and the derivative was a function of x and y. And what we had done is we'd gone through some basic ideas of, okay, well, what happens if x is 0? What happens if y is 0? What happens if the derivative is 0? What happens with the derivative is 1? And we were able to generate a rough approximation of this slope field. We then looked at a more complete example of the slope field. And we said, okay, given an initial condition, what do we notice? We took our initial value of 2 comma 0 and just basically traced in where does this go from there? What is the shape? And in this particular case, we saw this sort of U-shaped, whoops, okay, that's super awkward because it totally wasn't what I intended to do. What I intended to do is this. We saw that this curve would be in this sort of U shape. Now, looking over here, we see a completely different curve, but nothing over here will match that initial condition of 2 comma 0, where we need to be at that point at some time. So this right here doesn't meet my initial condition, but that sort of U shape there does. So let's look at some more graphs. This is example 8 in our textbook. I apologize for the darkness. I took a picture of the problem and it doesn't seem to have come out very well. I'm hoping you can see it. If not, you'll never know because I'll watch the video and redo it. So let's look at these graphs and how do we decide which graph goes with which derivative? So what I'm going to do is, again, I'm going to go back and I'm going to look at some of the ideas of, well, what happens when x equals 0? What happens when y equals 0? What happens when the derivative is equal to 0? So let's start with the derivative equal to 0 because these are easy to find on the graph. It will look like this on my slope field. Well, the first one, x equals y. The second one, x equals 0 or y equals 0. The third one, x equals 0, but this is undefined on the y-axis. And the fourth one, y equals 0, but undefined on the x-axis. So looking at these graphs, here's what I see. First of all, graph C appears to be undefined on the y-axis. Let me get a thicker pen since this is dark. Appears to be undefined on the y-axis, and it sure does look like we got a slope of 0 along that x-axis. So this would have to be number 4. Undefined when x is equal to 0, but 0 when y is equal to 0. Let me switch that to undefined. Now, let's look at graph D. You can't actually see, but it could be undefined or it could just be 0. But we also see that it's definitely equal to 0 when x is equal to 0. So that's x equal to 0. This was y equals 0. So probably that's number 3, although again, a little bit hard to tell because we could have slopes of 0 all along the x-axis. However, jumping over to here, what do I see on A and B? Well, definitely not B. Not worried about the x or y axes there. Okay, this is interesting. When x equals 0, we have a slope of 0. But actually, we have a much better look at what's happening here. Notice that these lines look like they're going to be vertical along y equals 0, along the x-axis. So in fact, this is number 3. That is not number 3. Because now what we see is coming back here, we see that the slope is going to be equal to 0 along the x-axis, y equals 0. Well, when they're both 0, hey, look at that. There's my number 2. Finally, we could say, well, at x equals y has to be b because both x and y have to be equal in order to have a slope of 0. Do I see a slope of 0 along the line y equals x? And no, I guess I sort of do. So here's the line y equals x. Now what we have here is we don't actually have the line y equals x. But what happens in between? What happens in between these two things right here? I've got one there and I've got one there. I expect there to be a 0 right there. So in fact, I see a slope of 0. And if I go right up in between all of these, I see that I'm going to have a slope of 0 at every point along there, which is equation number 1. So this is really the best way to analyze these kinds of things. You're looking for the following. You're looking for slope equals 0. You're looking for what happens when x equals 0. What happens when y is equal to 0? If you look at those 3 things, you can generally puzzle it out. All right. So let's see. I'm going to have you go ahead and do exercise 39. If you're in my class, and if you're not, if you're working along in the same book, you're more than welcome to jump in and do that. And that is slope fields. We'll be back with a quick section recap video. Thanks for watching.